Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath. And today we're going to be talking about reconstructing the historical Jesus Christ. How do scholars go about reconstructing the historical Jesus? And what are the complications with that endeavor? So, James, thank you very much for joining me today.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, there we go. I thought you were still muted there. All right. So, can you take us for a little journey here about how do scholars sort out between material in the Gospels that are probably not true and material that probably reflect historical reality?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. It's a great question. In historical scholarship in general, a lot of the same principles that are used in evaluating evidence, say in a court of law, are used, and a lot of that, is intuition, right? Human intuition about, when are people telling the truth? How do we get at that? And just as in the legal system, although in a much more systematic way, historians have worked out principles of argumentation, evaluation, and what sets apart historical Jesus study, at least historically, right? You'll forgive the pun, is that when it comes to the historical Jesus, it was felt that there is a different sort of overlay of later tradition, later doctrine, right? Certainly there are later transformations that a figure like, let's say, George Washington undergoes. There are stories that get circulated about him, sometimes so widely that people believe them, like young George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. But that doesn't compare to having creeds written about someone, defining their divine and human nature, things like that. And the historical Jesus effort emerged out of the Enlightenment, which was a knock-on effect of the Reformation's challenge to the church and its authority. And so I would say that from the outset, at least of that period, the modern historical Jesus quest, there was a desire and a felt need to get behind the layers of doctrine and dogma. And so there was a higher degree of skepticism, right? And a suspicion that many scholars coming to this had, and some still continue to have, that the sources are likely to be lying to us, are likely to be giving us the later church's perspective and not the perspective of Jesus and his earliest followers. And so the effort was formulated in terms of how do we get back behind that? And there were these, some of which are, commonsensical and some of which are highly problematic, but the so-called criteria of authenticity that were formulated. And some of those are just standard historical reasoning put in a shorthand form. Like, if this detail doesn't serve the interests of the author, in fact, runs counter to them, then it's unlikely that they invented it, right? If you are talking about a candidate that you strongly support, you don't talk about the such and such a scandal, right? You don't make that up. You will talk about it if it's something that is being circulated. The fact that it goes back before our author doesn't automatically mean that it's historical, but it allows us to get behind these texts, right? And that's sort of the crucial element there. What's happened of late is that there has been a greater emphasis on memory and how memory works, and in the process of that, two things have come about. One is recognition that there is no pre-theological Jesus, that Jesus seems to have understood himself in a religious way and in a religious context, and thus the quest to find a sort of a Jesus that has no messianic self-understanding. I mean, certainly we should be open to that as a possibility that the evidence might present to us, but we need to be careful about, in the interest of challenging later church tradition and being skeptical of it, of not excluding material that could actually come from sort of the religious viewpoint of Jesus himself, right? And so a recognition of the need to do that the people who remembered him, the earliest ones, right, and that were dependent on their memories, had doctrines and beliefs, and at least they were influenced by Jesus. And while they may have gone beyond anything that he said, and they may have interpreted him in ways sometimes that even ran counter to what he said, there's a direct influence. And so the possibility that there's some continuity in the religious interpretation of Jesus and his significance, and that there's possibly some memory, however distorted. Our understanding of memory allows us to get at that. And then the other thing that Dale Allison in particular has helped us to really rethink is the tendency of the earlier quest to focus on individual sayings and to treat each one atomistically and say, only once we've figured out, does this saying go back to the historical Jesus and how certain we are, then we start to assemble them into a picture, right? And memory, if we remember anything at all, we remember the gist of something first and foremost, right? And then maybe a couple of details. And if it's a very vivid memory, we might remember a lot of details. But if we don't get the gist right, then you can be pretty sure that we're not going to remember any details, except occasionally, right? There might be something that was a very vibrant. It's like, oh, I remember the punchline. I can't remember what the joke was leading up to it, because of the punchline. I remember it being very funny, and so our memory does work that way, right? But on the whole, we remember the gist. And so if the Gospels are wrong about Jesus being this apocalyptic figure who predicted the end of history, and he spoke about himself in messianic terms and predicted that judgment was coming and things like that, then they're unlikely to be right about anything, right? And so starting with the gist is something else that's new. And so scholarly approaches, while there's still a lot of continuity and a lot of the same principles that have guided us in the past continue to do so, historical study, whether it's the historical Jesus, it's the early church, it's ancient Judaism, it's ancient Rome, it's the Greek philosophers, all historical investigation is shaped by progress in our understanding of how people remember, how traditions get passed along, and all of these things. And so New Testament scholarship reflects some of the latest trends in those areas as well.
Does looking at John the Baptist assist in attempts to reconstruct the historical Jesus?
I just happen to be very interested in John the Baptist. Thank you for a question that allows me to talk about something I think is really interesting and important. And so one thing that we get across the New Testament documents, not in Paul, but Paul is not giving us storytelling about Jesus for the most part. He gives us reference to occasional traditions, but he's not doing that thing. But in the stories about Jesus, he's consistently linked with John the Baptist, right? Mark has Jesus start doing public things after John is put in prison and after he's been baptized by John, and so steps into the role of John's successor in his movement. Matthew emphasizes, right, highlights that Jesus spoke in a lot of the same ways that John did, even using some of the same phrases. Luke connects John and Jesus from before they were born, and the Gospel of John has Jesus active before John has been put in prison, and so perhaps as part of John's movement, there again too, and has John the Baptist in a way that most historians are very skeptical of. And rightly so, because this is a later gospel introducing these things on a trajectory that we can trace across the gospel's development, but has John the Baptist places in his mouth statements that Jesus has to increase and he, John, has to decrease. And of course, that's what the church was trying to do in its overall trajectory, was to emphasize that Jesus is the fulfillment of what John was doing and what he predicted. And what that means is that Jesus gets his start under the auspices of John's movement, and that the earliest questions that the followers of Jesus were wrestling with was, what's the relationship between Jesus and John? Is Jesus John's successor? Is he the fulfillment of John's predictions about a coming one, and things of that sort? And so my view is that we've rushed past the questions about the historical John the Baptist too quickly in our interest of getting to the historical Jesus. And that unless we actually pay close attention to John, then we're likely to get the historical Jesus wrong as well. Jesus links his own authority, his own activity to John in a way that he doesn't do with any other person. And he even says things like John is the greatest person that ever lived. Right? Among those born of women, there's been none greater than John.
What do you think that suggests about how Jesus thought about John the Baptist?
Yeah. So some who know that saying will immediately say, okay, but he then goes on to say that the least in the kingdom of God is greater than John. The meaning of that can't be that like John is excluded the kingdom, and so there's people who enter the kingdom of God and they're great and greater than John, and then John is like a remnant of this age that misses out on that. The meaning has to be something like, right, because those born of women and those in the kingdom are overlapping, circles. If we made a Venn diagram, and so it has to be a contrast of a different sort. And I'm inclined to think that the meaning is something like, as great as John is now, the greatest person that was ever born among women, the least in the kingdom of God, right? When the kingdom of God fully dawns, the least in that context, in that kingdom, in that age to come, will be greater than John. Right? And so it's not saying anything about John's greatness or Jesus's greatness within that context.
Do you think the historical Jesus believed himself to be the Messiah and the Son of God, or were these later views after Jesus died?
Yeah, another great question. And I think one reason that sometimes pious scholars, like scholars who have a faith commitment and who are trying to force themselves to be historically skeptical, but also are treating Jesus with some reverence, shy away from talking about Jesus' own messianic self-understanding, is that people who think of themselves as like the chosen one, we tend to think of not very favorably, right, as potentially out of their minds, but at the very least as deluded, having delusions of grandeur and things like that. And so there's been an avoidance of talking about it at all in certain circles, and a tendency to just talk about what the church said. But some of the sayings that are attributed to Jesus seem to imply that kind of status for himself, right? There are sayings about the king who will come, and unless we presuppose a radical break between Jesus and his followers after him, he probably at least entertained the possibility that God was appointing him to that role. And something seemed to make that clear, right? So one saying that scholars tend to judge historical has Jesus saying, when the kingdom comes, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's found in the Q source for those who posit that. But it's one of those sayings that overlaps between Matthew and Luke. And the version, like one of the Gospels changes it from "you will sit on thrones" rather than 12 thrones. The statement "you will sit on 12 thrones" addressed to Jesus's 12 apostles, his 12 like inner circle of 12 appointees, includes Judas, right? If he's saying it at that time, and so that's a problem that Jesus is predicting that he will sit on a throne judging the tribes of Israel, and because that reflects the sort of the Jewish, Israelite reconstruction, regathering view that was part of Jewish apocalyptic, but that the church sort of shifted away from. And because it envisages Judas's participation in that, it's often thought to be historical. And if Jesus envisages his representatives judging the tribes of Israel, then surely his authority in the age to come is greater than theirs. And so they are acting as judges on behalf of him as the ultimate judge and ruler. And so there's good reason to think that the status that the early church attributed to Jesus was one that he himself envisaged that God was going to exalt him to. And so I tend in that direction. I tend to think that. When we use a phrase like Son of God, we have to define it carefully. We certainly have attributed to Jesus, placed on the lips of Jesus, plausibly, things like the Aramaic word Abba, right, which doesn't mean daddy. It's not a special word for father. It's just the Aramaic word for father. But we get it in Paul's letters. We get it in Mark, right? And so, plus we have the Lord's Prayer. And so all of this together points to Jesus having addressed God as Father. And that doesn't necessarily mean, it certainly doesn't mean something like God the Son, right? Son of God did not mean God the Son, as it would in later times. It did not mean second person of the Trinity, something like that. It was the language of, at the very least, of obedient service to God. And we certainly see Jesus thinking of himself in those terms. Whether he was also using it in the sense of, the Davidic king, right? There's a psalm that was a coronation psalm, right, from ancient Israel that said, you are my beloved. This, today I have begotten you, or I've made you my son. Right? And so there was this idea that the king is adopted as God's son and becomes God's son, and thus God's viceroy, right, in a special sense. And so that kind of language, right, if it's historical, may also indicate something about Jesus' royal messianic self-understanding.
Was Jesus seen historically as a successor to John the Baptist, or is that connection more of a gospel innovation?
I'm inclined to think that there's a historical reality behind it. Part of it because there's still an open question, right, from the perspective of the gospel authors, right, regardless of whether John was in prison at the time, and if so, whether he sent a question to Jesus about whether he was the coming one. But the question on the narrative level seems to imply that Jesus might just be stepping into the role of leader of John's movement, but not claiming to be the one that John predicted would carry out judgment, right? John is put in prison. It would be natural for somebody else to step into the, to regather his followers and say, this work is not done yet. And that would not automatically mean that they're the one who is going to fulfill this particular role. It might be an invitation, like from John, for him to do so, if there was anything historical about it. But it might also be a question that gave the gospel author on the lips of Jesus a chance to address explicitly a question that John the Baptist may not have had the opportunity to ask Jesus. Right? We have no reason to think that Herod Antipas would have let him send a message to his followers from prison, although it's not entirely impossible, right? And Jesus seems to have had a connection with the court of Herod Antipas, right? One of his followers was the wife of, and one of his sponsors, in fact, was the wife of Herod's property manager. And so it's not entirely implausible either, but we need to think about some of those details. And we also are going to have a high degree of uncertainty because there's so much we simply don't know. But I think that, at least in the first instance, Jesus would have been viewed as, at the very least, regathering John's followers and keeping his movement going after his imprisonment.
Did Jesus inherit much of John the Baptist's teachings, or did they diverge on a lot of points? Or is it a mixed bag?
Yeah, that's another great question. I'm inclined to think that the relationship was predominantly one of continuity. Jesus is definitely an innovator, right? So that's not in question. He's distinctive. The question is whether he's innovating on a foundation laid by John. And I think the answer is yes. Right? The Gospels give the impression that Jesus is proclaiming the message that John proclaimed, right? Matthew says it explicitly that before Jesus is proclaiming a message that can be summarized as repent for the kingdom of God is at hand, John is proclaiming that. Jesus' movement is a Baptist movement, right? I mean, he and or his followers are baptizing people. And the ethical teaching, right? There seems to be continuity, talking about bearing fruit and, you know, the axe at the root of the trees and, you know, judgment with fire and things like that. It is continuous between both of them. One question, some of the questions I have about some of the details are, you know, what was different about Jesus, if anything? I don't think that the dining habits was a point of contrast or of disagreement so much as one of contrast. We have no indication that John expected his followers to like eat locusts and wild honey or something like that. And so the fact that Jesus' dietary habits were different and his accepting table fellowship invitations was different is not a point of contrast, just a point of difference. There are several stories in the gospel where Jesus is said to heal people and pronounce their sins forgiven, and there's no explicit indication that they immerse in water, right? And so the question of whether Jesus ever pronounced sins forgiven without baptism of any sort, whether he used something other than flowing water when there were people who were paralyzed, those are important questions that need to be asked of some of those stories.
So now I'd like to shift to the Q source. Could you remind the audience what Q exactly is? And my second part to that question is, can Q be used to reconstruct the historical Jesus? And how do you feel about that in light of it being a hypothetical document being used to reconstruct the historical Jesus?
Yeah, both great questions. And anytime we're using something that's hypothetical, right, we need to proceed with a certain amount of caution, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But in short, the dominant view for most of the last century, and a view that still remains dominant, is that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest, and that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. The key question that's where currently there's at least a shift away from there being an overwhelming consensus to there being much more diversity and much more vibrant discussion is about the relationship between Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke overlap on material that's not in Mark. And so the two options are either that one of them knew the other and copied from that gospel, or both of them depend on a shared source. So just as each of them seems to have used Mark independently, perhaps they also got this other material from an earlier source. And so that source, that hypothetical source, is what's known as the Q document. And the reason why scholars posited there being a Q document, right, when it's much simpler to say that one of them copied from the other, is that on the one hand, there seems to be very alternating primitivity, right? And so sometimes Matthew has a version of a saying that seems like it might be the more original form of the saying. And on the other hand, Luke seems to be more primitive, right? More original. And so that's more readily explained if each of them is independently using this third entity, this other document that we no longer have. The other thing is that the differences between the Gospels are hard to explain in terms of their, you know, one of them directly knowing the other. All you have to do is imagine Matthew taking Luke's Gospel, let's say, and dropping the material that's there in the infancy and substituting something else that contradicts it, or Luke doing that with Matthew, to realize that it's not obvious that anyone would choose to do this, right? And so that's the kind of evidence that has pointed in the direction of there possibly being an earlier written document. That because it's hypothetical, right, there's some uncertainty there. And so the good news in this case is that when we talk about using a hypothetical document, we're talking about material that actually does show up in our second earliest gospel that we do have, whether that's Matthew or Luke, right? And depending on one's view of the relationship, one might think that Matthew is somewhat earlier, Luke is somewhat earlier. And there's good reason to think, right, again, using some of that historical reasoning I talked about earlier, that the material is not invented by Matthew or by Luke. And it's material that was felt to be important enough that, and well known enough that whether Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew, if that's one's view, it was felt to be worth including, right, and keeping from that source. And so that material doesn't cease to be relevant to the historical Jesus, regardless of whether one accepts the Q hypothesis. It's just a question of how early we think it is, and whether the Q material might have had a different shape, right? That's significant to how we think about the development of Christianity, and thus of the historical Jesus, than either Matthew or Luke does, right? And so just as Mark being earlier, we prioritize what Mark tells us, although we don't exclude the possibility that Matthew or Luke might include things that Mark omitted, or might include an earlier form of things that Mark included. So too, right, in the case of the Q source, it's just giving us the possibility of this material having had a different shape that can tell us something about an earlier stage in its development.
So how does the Q source portray Jesus in contrast to the Gospels that we have?
Yeah, so there's a sense in which I think one has to ask that about the Q material as we see it as a whole, right? And there has been some scholarly work trying to reconstruct earlier stages and redactional phases and redactional material in Q so that you get multiple layers there. And I find that problematic, not just because it's taking something hypothetical and adding additional hypotheses to its character and development, and doing that in ways that the evidence just won't support. But I think that the material as a whole hangs together in interesting ways, right? So it's the earliest thing we get from Matthew and Luke is in the material with which the Gospels start the public activity of Jesus, namely material about John the Baptist and what he's proclaiming, right? So Mark starts with John the Baptist. Matthew and Luke do so as well and include Mark's information, but then also each add things about what John the Baptist taught. And Luke adds some still additional material there, which, if there was a Q source, may have come from Q, right? And maybe that Matthew left some of it out. And so we have those kinds of questions that are raised by the Q hypothesis. The Q hypothesis connects Jesus with John, has Jesus asked whether he's the coming one that John predicted, and provide indication that the answer one should understand is yes. Predicts that he's going to carry out judgment, right? And so in a lot of ways, it's addressing the concerns that followers of John the Baptist would have had, probably in particular after the crucifixion, but maybe even earlier, right? Some of this material may have started to take shape, that Jesus is executed, right? Or certainly doesn't carry out the judgment that John's coming one was supposed to, right? To have a winnowing fork in his hand and clear the threshing floor and take the chaff and cast into the fire and gather the good crop into barns. This separating of the good and evil, Jesus doesn't do that. And some of the Q material envisages that eschatological judgment in a way that I think is addressing that, right? It's predicting that Jesus will be that person, right? And so you have these Son of Man sayings, right? And these traditions run throughout the Gospels, but the Son of Man tradition, I think, is about whether Jesus is the one that John spoke of, right? Son of Man is not a title in Aramaic, right? It becomes a title as it is translated very literally into Greek, and then it becomes familiar outside of its original linguistic context. But in Aramaic, it's just one. And yet it's in a definite form, and so Jesus seems to have talked about the one. And in context, that would be the one, the coming one, right? The one who is to come, the one that John talked about. And so the categories of sayings that include the phrase "Son of Man" are, some of them are present related, right? And so you have them. Oftentimes, they're just would reflect the wider Aramaic usage and be about human beings, but in some instances, might be about Jesus as a human being. Passion saying, so about the Son of Man needing to suffer, right? And so it being the destiny of the coming one to follow more closely in John's footsteps than John had predicted or and spoken about, and thus more closely resembling John than his followers were expecting. And then parousia sayings, right? Sayings about the coming in judgment, the arrival in glory, which assert that Jesus will do those things, right? And so, far from it being the case that these are three disparate types of saying, where historical Jesus only used one of them, and the early church overlaid two. It may be that there's non-historical material in all three categories, but the question of how Jesus relates to John, that's woven into the Son of Man tradition, I think does take us back probably to the activity of Jesus himself, when people would have begun asking this question. And all that is woven through the Q source, right? So we get the judgment sayings, we get Jesus teaching things, and he and his apostles predicted to do things that were precisely the things that John spoke about and predicted.
Did Q go through redactional stages before the material ended up in Matthew and Luke, or do you think it went on untampered until it went into Matthew and Luke?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is we don't know, right? And there's a sense in which Matthew and Luke, each in the way that they do things with the Q material, if there was a Q source, is tampering with Q, right, and doing things with it. And yet the fact that we can detect that there was material, right, and whether it's borrowed directly by one from the other, or each borrowed from a Q source, there's a usage that is not happy to simply rewrite, right? And that's, I think, significant. And so the question of whether there was were earlier stages, I mean, on the one hand, I'd say I don't know, and I don't exclude the possibility. On the other hand, I feel that some of much of the scholarship about redactional layers of Q is premised on the Q source being a sayings collection, right? And that takes the genre that one thinks this material should be in and uses it to exclude other material, including the material with which the Q contents begins, right, which is the John the Baptist stuff. And of course, so I think that we should take Q as a whole and take seriously the coherence of it if we want to envisage a Q document at all, and only after that ask, might this have taken shape in a particular way? For instance, if the John the Baptist material was central to it and included some of Jesus' teaching within that context, it may have accumulated other sayings of Jesus, right? As people, or maybe the first person to ever write this stuff down in the form of Q, decided, as they thought of other sayings of Jesus, to just add them in and things like that, right? So I think those possibilities are worth exploring, right? I'm not dismissive of them by any means. I do think, though, that assumptions about what Q looked like have been allowed to dictate the conclusion, right, or the deduction that material is secondary, when in fact it's the beginning of Q as we see it peeking through Mark and Luke, and we should start with that, right? We should take seriously that this made sense to someone as an introduction to this material, and until we've made sense of why the whole would be put together in this form, asking about earlier layers really risks us imposing our assumptions and our perspectives and our ideas of logic and of coherence onto this ancient material.
When would you say was the Q source written? Was it written before Mark? And if so, when would you place it?
Yeah, there too. I mean, I will keep my I would hesitate to try to estimate a date, simply because we don't know, right? If you look at an introduction to the New Testament, if you look at something like earlychristianwritings.com, which tries to give the full range of viewpoints that anyone has expressed, you'll find this range. And scholars will sometimes, like if the dates for the Gospel of Mark are said to be from 60 to 80 or 50 to 80 or something like that, then you'll get them saying, well, let's split the difference and say it's somewhere in the middle. But of course, the middle point in a range of possibility is not inherently more likely, right? Just because it's in the middle, right? That's not how a range works. And on the one hand, the Q source doesn't seem to have much in the way of narrative. I mean, it has some, and maybe there was more, right? It may be that it was thought to be a supplement to the Gospel of Mark, right? And was written not long after it. On the other hand, Mark is aware that Jesus taught, but doesn't tell us much about what he taught. And it may thus be possible that the Q source was put together first, right? In the context of discussing how Jesus related to John the Baptist as his successor and things like that. And that Mark is then saying, okay, so you know the saying and some of the narrative, but here, let me tell you about this guy in more detail, right? So both of those are possibilities. If there was a Q source, though, one would want to put it, not that far away from Mark, either before or after, presumably.
What do you make of the Mark Q overlaps? Is this evidence that Mark knew Q, or did he know an adjacent tradition or a common source to Q? What do you make of it?
Yeah, and of course, whether there were Mark Q overlaps, is more or less impossible to say with certainty, precisely because there have been at least some who've entertained the possibility that Q didn't narrate the baptism of Jesus, right? And it may also be that Matthew and Luke, each using Mark and Q independently, went with Mark for the narrative and then included some additional saying material from Q, and that there was narrative that was different from Mark in Q about Jesus' baptism, and they left it out. But it's also possible that there's significant overlap. And so, especially if we envisage, let's say, the Q source coming together maybe as something that was really quite rough, and then Mark being much more of a narrative that's trying to tell a story from start to finish, that Mark may have included some things, right, just as points of contact, right? This is where the story intersects with Q. On the other hand, there is a fair amount that can be attributed to memory, and that can be memory either in terms of not knowing the written document, but the same story has been told, to hearing that, like the teaching that's recorded in Q read aloud in the context of a gathering of this movement, but never reading it, to having read it and then recalling it from memory, to actually using it deliberately but avoiding it, right? Much as some scholars think that the Gospel of John did with the Gospel of Mark, right? Having points of intersection, right? Because telling the same story, but difference as a sort of deliberate effort to supplement, which is how some view it, not all, right? And so there are too many possibilities to really know what to make of them, and there's too much uncertainty about how much, if at all, Mark and Q overlapped.
What do you make of the apocalyptic material in Mark as it compares to Q? Do they agree on a lot of points, or do they diverge on a lot of points from what you've seen?
Yeah. Well, if you don't take out the John the Baptist material and other things, as some scholars have been inclined to do, then I do think that Mark and Q are on the same page. Right? There's going to be eschatological judgment. Jesus is going to follow John in a way of suffering, but will be vindicated by God and will do the things that the coming one is predicted to do. And so I think both are in the form in which we either have them in the case of Mark, or can detect them in the case of the full extent of the Q material in term as we know them from Matthew, Luke overlaps, are apocalyptic in their outlook.
So do you view Jesus as being primarily an apocalyptic preacher, or was there more to him than just that?
I mean, I don't want to say, every person is more than any particular label or category we might put on them. Perhaps with some exceptions, but human beings are. And so one thing that I would say in relation to that is that some have tried to exclude like ethical teaching, right, from the lips of as not authentic to Jesus because he was an apocalyptic figure. Right? Some have done the same with John. Some have rejected the apocalypticism of Jesus because they think the ethical teaching is authentic. And we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know from John the Baptist, if that material is giving us even the gist of John the Baptist, that apocalypticism and ethical teaching can go hand in hand. Being, calling for people to live differently and believing that God is going to hold people accountable are compatible. There's definitely some uncertainty about what the nature of the apocalyptic vision of John and or Jesus was. I do think that by the time we get towards the end of Jesus' public activity, that he's envisaging it being the case that God will install him, not that he will bring about sort of judgment sort of through his own action. He seems to have taught that the last will be first and the first will be last, right? That whoever humbles himself will be exalted, and vice versa. And so that the way for him to step into the role of carrying out judgment and ruling as the Davidic Messiah, if that's how he understood himself, was to humble himself and allow God to bring that about in his own way. And so I think apocalyptic, yes, and I think that's a point of continuity between him and John the Baptist, or between John the Baptist and him. More than that, yeah, I would say more than that, both about John and about Jesus.
Do you think that the historical Jesus believed himself to be a descendant of King David, or was that a later innovation?
That's a great question. There certainly were rulers over the people, right, and particularly over the Judeans or Jews, who were not of Davidic descent, right? The Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, as their dynasty was known, were of priestly origin. It's interesting that at the end of the Proto-Evangelium of James, we have an indication that some thought of John in similar terms, right? So he's on the one hand of priestly descent, but Herod the Great is depicted in the Proto-Evangelium of James as concerned that John, right, Zechariah's son, is to rule over Israel. And so some may have looked at John as destined to be a priest king, right? Some may have even suspected that when John was talking about a coming one, he was talking about his own return. And Jesus may have spoken about, right, a coming one, right, when the Son of Man comes and things like that, in ways that did not explicitly, and maybe not even implicitly, identify himself as that. There are enough sayings that suggest that he seems to have come to that understanding at least at some point, but initially he himself may have been uncertain about that. As to whether it's Davidic, it's hard to know. We get that very early, right? I mean, Paul is already talking about Jesus as of the seed of David, right, which implies not only Davidic descent, but Davidic descent along the paternal line. And so this needs to be distinguished from the question of, was he actually descended from David, right? Because lots of people have stories of illustrious ancestry that, if you do family history research, turns out to be nothing. On the other hand, both people who do have such stories and people who don't sometimes find connections. But there's enough of it, and it's widespread enough that it does seem likely that the family was reputed to have such a lineage. And whether that was something that was invented a generation or two earlier when some Judeans during the Hasmonean era made a settlement in Galilee, and they thought, I know how to get in well with this community, or whether it was something that was actually remembered, is something that we couldn't presume to answer, because even modern day family history research shows that both are possibilities.
So do you think that Jesus' teachings were being modified as like literally immediately after he died? Do you think that process like got going immediately?
I mean, why not start it earlier still, right? I mean, we hear people say things and we both misremember them, but also we interpret them in light of what we think, and so may distort them unintentionally, right? And then we can also assume somebody must have meant something else because of our assumptions. We can transform memories in our minds as our beliefs develop. And so I think any process of transformation involves human memory, right? And so I don't think that we should say, after the crucifixion, then suddenly they start rewriting everything that Jesus said. What the post-crucifixion Jesus movement is trying to do is to make sense of how this person that was crucified could nonetheless be the Messiah as they had expected him to be. And so even though there's a lot of reinterpretation that needs to happen, right, and there's some new structure that needs to be put in place to make sense of this and what happened to Jesus, it's that Jesus that they remember and whose teaching they still recall, rightly, accurately or not, that they are trying to interpret in that way, right? And so we need, on the one hand, to recognize that transformation can happen even earlier than the crucifixion, and on the other hand, the post-crucifixion church is trying to make sense of how this person that the Romans executed, right, could be the Davidic Messiah nonetheless. And so continuity has to be part of that as well, right? If there was nothing from the historical Jesus that they could interpret in that way, then it would have been a project doomed to failure, right? I mean, it would have been something that had so much cognitive dissonance woven into it that there would have been no way for any more than a handful of people to find it plausible.
When you look at Paul in contrast to the Gospels, and to see how the resurrection story is developing after Jesus' death, what do you see?
So one thing we don't get in the Gospels, and certainly at least not explicitly, is the very apocalyptic way of understanding the significance of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there are some hints at it, particularly like in Matthew, right? We get this sense that he, in a bizarre move in his narrative, has other deceased people, apparently famous dead people, appear in the streets because Jesus' resurrection brings that about. And so there's at least an implicit indication, as Dale Allison explored in one of his early books, The End of the Ages Has Come, that this is an eschatological event, right? An end times event. This is Jesus' resurrection is connected with the final resurrection. But one could certainly understand it simply in terms of God vindicating Jesus after death and exalting him to a special status, and that the resurrection will happen later. And it's because the Gospels don't give us that kind of theological interpretation. It's really hard to know, right? Mark doesn't even give us resurrection appearances or anything like that. All we get is that a promise that he will be seen in Galilee, and there is an empty tomb, right? Or I should say a tomb in which Jesus' body is no longer there, because it was a tomb apparently for criminal burial, and so it was not empty, but empty of Jesus' body. And so there's some continuity, but more so with some gospels rather than others. And the question of whether anyone early on understood Jesus' vindication in non-apocalyptic terms, or at least non-eschatological, like envisaged there could be a long waiting period. It just seems consistent that there would be much more of a trajectory that moves from one end to the other. And Paul, as our earliest witness, suggests that Jesus' resurrection was connected with the general resurrection. It may be that Jesus anticipated that he was going to suffer as John had, and that this would be what triggered God bring about the resurrection, right? That God would intervene to raise John and Jesus from the dead, vindicate his chosen ones, perhaps his two messiahs, right? If John was thought of as a priestly messiah and counterpart to the royal messiah, Jesus. And so I think that all of this still fits within an apocalyptic framework, and no one is envisaging, prior to Luke and John, perhaps, and maybe not even then, but is envisaging a lengthy period of time passing between the death of Jesus and the belief that he's been raised from the dead, and the general resurrection of the dead that was part and parcel of the apocalyptic expectation within Judaism.
And for my final question, and we're going to be doing a longer show on this later this month on the Gospel of John, but just real quick, I wanted to ask you, do you see the Gospel of John as also a valuable source for the historical Jesus? Because I know several others would dismiss John. Some will dismiss John entirely.
So I will say yes, it's valuable. It clearly, doesn't have as much of the individual sayings and short stories and things like that.
James, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I saw that stop for a second.
Just repeat what you were saying last 10 seconds.
Yeah. So John is different enough from the other Gospels that we need to take that seriously. John is consistent in style within itself, regardless of who's speaking, that we have to recognize that we're not hearing the voice of Jesus or John, but the narrator, right, who speaks with that style. And any words attributed to John and Jesus are in the author's own style. That doesn't mean that there can't be historically useful information, right? And in particular, when it comes to the setting of some of the sayings, even when the discourses are viewed as creations of the author, things like the connection of the Jesus temple action with a saying about the temple being destroyed and rebuilt is something that historians consider quite plausible, right? The possibility that John, before John is put in prison, Jesus is doing stuff, and maybe that the temple action, in fact, was Jesus acting while still part of John's movement, right? That's something I explore in my recent books. And so I'm inclined to think that John needs to be taken seriously in that way, right? So we should use all our sources cautiously. When one shows that it's consistently in the author's own style, then we should not treat that distinctive style as reflective of the style of Jesus. On the other hand, right, some of the turns of phrase might be, right? If Jesus could plausibly be suggested to speak about his opponents as a brood of vipers, taking after John, then why could an author not also maintain some stylistic elements? So even there, we shouldn't just assume, right? But when there's that consistency of style, we need to treat it with that appropriate skepticism. But the author may be weaving narratives and weaving discourses to address the issues of his own time in ways that both incorporate things that he knew about Jesus and perhaps reinterprets them, but sometimes perhaps not, right? It's just stylistically doing something different. And on the other hand, maybe setting those within the context of moments that were things that were remembered from the life of Jesus, right? And so those are some key points about that. I think the one other thing I would say is that the other Gospels don't give us much in the way of lengthy discourses of Jesus, right? The closest that we get is perhaps in Matthew, where we have what seemed to be not a long discourse of Jesus on one occasion, but compilations of his shorter sayings and his teaching material and his parables and things like that. And if any of them had written something in which Jesus was depicted as, fleshing out the context of his sayings, the short pithy sayings that were remembered, and answering his opponents and things like that, each of them would have done it in their own style too, because again, that's how memory and storytelling work. And so the Gospel of John needs to be treated with appropriate skepticism, but not excessive skepticism.
And I just like to say to everybody real quick that I'll have the link to purchase James's books in the descriptions and in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, James, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure as always, Jacob. Great talking to you.
Likewise.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.